Hey there, welcome to the Energy Blueprint Podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I have with me for is this the third time? I think it's either the second or the third. I think it might be the third.
I think it is.
Third time, Dr. Evan Hirsch, who is an MD who specializes in chronic fatigue, and he's become a good friend of mine. And he actually works with us to some extent in the Energy Blueprint, and he's also got his own brand and his own program and approach to helping people with chronic fatigue, and specializing especially in people with chronic fatigue syndrome and severe chronic fatigue. And he does wonderful work, and I'm amazingly grateful to have him as a partner and someone who we can work together to help everybody who needs help. And with that said, obviously there's two other podcasts for you guys to listen to with great content, but we're going to get into even more great content in this podcast. So his official bio, he suffered with fatigue for 5 years before he achieved resolution using the Fix Your Fatigue program that he pioneered in his medical practice. And through his best-selling book and online programs, he's helped thousands of people across the nation optimize their energy, and he's on a mission to help 1 million more. He's board certified in family medicine and integrative medicine. And when he's not at the office, you can find him singing musicals, dancing, and playing basketball with his family. So welcome, my friend. Such a pleasure to have you again.
Thanks so much for having me on, Ari. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. So talk to me kind of the big picture of, you work with a lot of people with severe chronic fatigue, as I said, and chronic fatigue syndrome. Mm-hmm. In many cases, these are people that have tried lots of other things. They've been to conventional doctors, they've been to naturopaths, they've been maybe in some cases to other functional medicine doctors. They've tried all kinds of things. They've tried everything from veganism to keto to maybe even carnivore if they're really on it lately. And they're not getting results. They're not getting resolution of their fatigue and getting their energy back. So why do you feel people are still struggling with this chronic fatigue problem despite trying so many different things, trying so many different diets and therapies?
Such a great question. And it's so important because I see this all the time. People are like, I've tried everything. I know you can't help me because I've tried everything. And it's like, all right, well, what are your causes? Because what I've found is that it all comes back to the causes. When you actually know what your causes are, then you can really dive in and tailor your treatment specifically to what the cause is. But if you don't know what your cause is and you're going ahead and you're doing a number of whatever treatments that maybe are research-based, maybe are not, but are supposed to be helpful, then you're not going to be successful. Like if somebody doesn't have heavy metal toxicity and you're doing a heavy metal chelation protocol, like it's not going to help that person. Or if this person doesn't have mold and they're doing a mold protocol, so you have to know what your causes are, and then in order to be able to remove them and actually have success in what you're doing.
Yeah. I remember from one of our past interviews, maybe the first interview, you gave the analogy of like, if someone has 16 nails stuck in their foot and, you only, sort of through a more random approach, you only end up pulling out 2 or 3 of the nails. Well, or maybe even 5 or 6 of the nails. Well, you still got 10 left in there. So again, kind of coming back to this importance of being able to zero in on what are the unique root causes for that particular individual. So with that in mind, how do you conceptualize this kind of broad landscape of all the different potential causes that someone might have of their chronic fatigue? Because this is a symptom. It's sort of like a fever, right? A fever can be a symptom of lots and lots of different kinds of infections, everything from a urinary tract infection to a cold, to the flu, to AIDS, to Ebola, right? To the coronavirus. So how do you see, understanding that fatigue is a symptom that's like that, it can be caused by many different factors. Right. How do you break down this landscape of the causes of fatigue?
So I try to go broad. I know that if I'm looking at every single potential cause of fatigue, then I'm not going to miss anything. But like you said, that's incredibly exhaustive. And so we also have to look at common. So what are the most common causes of fatigue, while at the same time trying to leave no stone unturned? So when we go into the causes, we're going to talk about breaking them down into different categories. But at this point, I have found there's like 33 different causes that I want to look at, and then, but based off of somebody's symptoms, if we're looking at their subjective experience and their symptoms, and then we're looking at the labs and we put those together, that's going to help us narrow that down even more. But I know that the broader that I go, and this is kind of what I saw over time, is that I would get people better to a certain point, and then I would be like, okay, I can't get them the rest of the way better. What am I missing? I would learn that. I would add that into the causes list, and then I would address it. And then that person would get even, better. And then the next person will be like, okay, I can't get this person better. What is it? I learned something else. I try it out on them. If it worked, okay, great. Now that's another cause. So just trying to get as broad as possible, so I'm leaving no stone unturned, so that it may take longer to get there if we're assessing all of these causes, and it may be expensive in terms of looking at the labs, but we're going to get there. And so that's the whole point, is that people have been suffering for 3, 5, 10 years. Who cares if they're spending 6 months finding the causes, right? You're going to find the causes, you're going to be able to then resolve them.
So take me through, like, obviously 33 is a lot, but maybe you can list out, the top 5 or 8 or 10, sort of most common causes that you found of fatigue, and understanding that there might be some rare exotic infection that's maybe the sole cause. For one person, they did a trip to Africa a year ago and now they got infected with some weird parasite, and that's the cause of their symptoms. But barring those sort of 0.1% of cases of fatigue, what do you think are the 80%, kind of the 80-20 world? What do you think are the main root causes for, let's say, 80% of people dealing with chronic fatigue?
Yeah, so what we're going to talk about is, I'm going to group these into like 10 causes or 10 categories of causes. And those are really in classifications of deficiencies or toxicities. So deficiencies are things that aren't in the body that are supposed to be in the body. And then toxicities are things that are in the body that aren't supposed to be there, right? So that kind of helps to simplify it a little bit. And then in terms of the deficiencies, we're looking at deficiencies in hormones. And so that's adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones. We're looking at deficiencies in mitochondria, which I know you know way more about than I do. We're talking about deficiencies in nutrients like vitamins and minerals. We're talking about deficiencies in lifestyle factors. So not enough sleep, not enough exercise or movement, not enough good, healthy food, not enough water. So those are kind of the main deficiencies that we're looking at. And then when we're looking at toxicities, we're looking at heavy metals. We know that over 100,000 pounds are dumped into our oceans every single year. Among other places that we're getting 100,000 pounds of mercury are dumped into our oceans. Leads, arsenic. We're talking about chemicals, 84,000 different chemicals we're exposed to on a regular basis. Most of those haven't been tested by the FDA. We're talking about molds. Over half of the buildings in this country have water damage, and a lot of those have molds. We're talking about infections, over 300,000 people who have been infected with a Lyme type illness, according to the Centers for Disease Control. And then additional other type infections beyond just Lyme or Borrelia, Bartonella and Babesia and Anaplasma, and then bugs in the gut like certain bacterias, bacillus and yeasts, and then there's parasites and emotions. So it's kind of like a big picture of those 10. And then,
Did you say parasites and emotions?
Yes, I didn't mean to group those together, but
it was funny. We listed off so many different specific species of microbes and pathogens, and then you're like, and emotions.
Yeah, and I shouldn't gloss over it, because emotions are so important. What I've learned, and I actually didn't think emotions were that important when I first started out, because I was MD, and even though I was open to it, it really wasn't my bag. But my wife is a mindfulness coach, and what I've seen, the more that she's taught me and the more that I've learned about mindset, about limbic retraining, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for emotion and memory, that when we adjust those things, people are so much more successful.
Absolutely. So that's a really nice breakdown of kind of this whole landscape. So, there's a couple ways we can go from here. So I know, obviously, you have a clinical practice. You've been in clinical practice, I don't know, for what, a decade or something like that, or more?
15 years, yeah.
Yeah. So you have a particular protocol and kind of system for how you go about this when you're working one-on-one with a patient. I know also that you are about to release your new program on helping people with chronic fatigue, and it's based on this same system. So I'm curious, I guess, let me ask you how you would go about helping people identify what are their unique causes, what are their unique deficiencies and toxicities of the things that you just listed, in a one-on-one setting, and how are you going to do it in the context of your new online program?
That's a great question, because that was something that I struggled with. How do I translate what I'm doing in my one-on-one into an online course? And so I'll tell you exactly what I did. So I created a workbook. It's basically a 72-page workbook that kind of takes them through the exact thought process that I do. So when assessing the causes, we always want to look at subjective plus objective. Okay, we want to look at the symptoms plus the labs and physical exam if that's present. And so what I did is I created checklists. I can actually share my screen with you if you're interested, and I can kind of walk people through this process.
Yeah, please. It will, I mean, we'll put this on YouTube. So anybody who wants to see it, there'll be people who are just listening to this. So just communicate it in a way where those people can follow along if they're just listening and not seeing the visuals. But yeah, I would love for you to do that.
Okay, great. This is the workbook. And so step one of my process is to assess the causes. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. And so we're going to be looking at the symptoms as well as the objective. And so there's this page here that I have on the causes of fatigue. And so we just talked about all the deficiencies and we talked about the toxicities. So what's really important too is if you see these pluses and these minuses and next to them, is that I found that 75% of all of these causes can be determined by symptoms.
Mm.
Okay, and you know how imperfect labs are.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to try to collect all the potential data that we can, and it's great when we're good at assessing for symptoms. And so the pluses are symptoms. I've got the key down here. The minuses are laboratory tests, and then the equals are both. Okay, so that you actually know where to spend your money too, because that's the thing too, is that you could spend $4,000, get a whole bunch of labs, and yeah, it's going to help you, but what are the most important labs to get? And they're going to be the ones that have the minus signs right next to them, and that's some of them over here in the toxicity section. So these are all check boxes, because as we go through this process, you can come back up to the cause and you check it off, because then you know what to fix in step 2 through 4. Which is, it's a 4-step process. The first step is assessing, which is what we're talking about now. Step 2 is replacing these deficiencies. Step 3 is opening up the detoxification pathways so that we can do step 4, which is removing the toxicities.
Got it.
So if we're jumping in here to the deficiencies, so when we're looking for adrenal dysfunction, as you know, labs, not so good. And so we're looking for, what is the normal function of the adrenal gland? We know that it produces aldosterone, which is responsible for salt balance and is responsible for regulating blood pressure, and we're cortisol, regulating circadian rhythm and stuff like that. So we know what the function is of these hormones. And so we can look at what the dysfunction is. And so these are a lot of the symptoms that people will experience. Then there's some lab tests that can be done. And you and I have kind of talked about some of these, and they're not great tests, but they're kind of part of what we have right now. But then,
well, actually, I mean, I would say cortisol testing is quite accurate. The issue is it's just arguable to what extent cortisol levels really correlate well with fatigue symptoms explicitly. But but the tests for cortisol levels are quite accurate. But yeah, some of the other ones, DHEA, I couldn't comment on the accuracy of that. But yeah, the adrenal dysfunction is it's a controversial one, but it does exist. And as you mentioned, circadian rhythm, I definitely think, in my as you know, I did a lot of digging into that subject, and I think
Hmm.
circadian rhythm dysfunction, probably more than anything, that's what correlates with low morning cortisol levels. So if somebody has low morning cortisol levels, it's a really good potential indicator of circadian rhythm disruption.
Right. Yeah,
So,
and for me, symptoms are so much more important than the labs anyway on so much of this stuff.
mm-hmm,
And so I put together all of it here in the educational section. So this is, in my experience, it's likely that someone has dysfunction if they've got 5 or more of the above symptoms, and then it can be corroborated by the labs.
mm-hmm,
And so someone can look at this and they can say, okay, so, in conclusion, do I have this cause or don't I have this cause? If they say yes, they mark it off here. They go back up to the causes page and they can mark it off there so that they know, okay,
yeah,
I've got this cause, and then I can move on to step 2 through 4 once we get there.
nice. Take me through some of the other ones.
Yeah. So we've got mitochondrial dysfunction, and a lot of these are pretty non-specific. You can do some levels, glutathione, CoQ10, the 8-hydroxy-T-deoxyguanosine or whatever. But I find that everybody who's got fatigue requires mitochondrial support,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah,
and so this would be a yes, and they'd mark it off on the first page. And then thyroid deficiency or thyroid dysfunction, and I've also asterisked some of the most important symptoms.
mm-hmm.
And so when we go down to, and I've got my
So
lab.
just for people listening who are not seeing this on YouTube, under thyroid dysfunction, he's got a list of symptoms. For example, obviously fatigue, cold extremities. So if your hands and feet are cold often, hair loss, dry skin and hair, brittle nails, difficulty losing weight and weight gain, blood sugar or blood pressure issues, depression, anxiety. So there are a number of symptoms there that are potential indicators of thyroid, and he's also kind of put an asterisk next to the ones that are specifically the best indicators of thyroid issues. And then below this list, if your symptoms match up, then you can do a particular lab test to corroborate whether those symptoms are likely coming from abnormal thyroid levels, TSH, T4, T3, and so on. And then based on that, as you're going through this workbook, then you would mark yes or no and say, yes, thyroid deficiency, I do have that going on, so this is likely a cause or a contributor to my fatigue issues.
Absolutely. And people also don't know what labs to do. So I tell them exactly, I've got a lab store and I've got a
Mm-hmm.
supplement store. So I can tell them exactly what labs to get. The lab will come directly to your home if it's a kit. Otherwise, it'll be something you can just print off and take to your local blood lab.
Mm-hmm.
In the supplements, I tell you exactly which supplements to get. And all of this whole workbook, I've divided into videos as well. So I have videos going through this workbook as well, so people can watch that. They can make comments below if they have questions. They can ask questions in the Facebook group, and I will answer it, or somebody on my team will answer it.
Excellent. Do you
And
want
go ahead.
do you want to keep going through more of this workbook? Is
I,
there
if you
any other sort of maybe some of the more remarkable pieces of this that you want to point out? Obviously, I'm sure going through this in detail, the whole thing could take up an hour or more easily. So I just want to make sure I'm not cutting you off, and also make sure that we can keep going.
Yeah, and absolutely, yeah, definitely jump in and catch me, because I get so excited about this stuff and I just get on a roll. So just let me know what's going to be
Yeah,
best use of our time.
yeah.
I did just want to, yeah, I'll jump into some of the stuff that's more significant in a minute. But I also did want to mention that I also put in exactly the range that you want on these lab tests. What I have found in 15 years of practice that are optimal ranges. Most of the ranges that you're going to see that are quote unquote normal ranges are actually just population based ranges. They're everybody who's taken the lab test and they put them into a bell curve, chop off the top and bottom fifth percentiles and call that normal. And that's definitely not normal. We
Mm-hmm.
want optimal. And so you get my optimal ranges with this as well. So you know exactly how to interpret the labs. If you have any questions, you can always ask. And so that we can get you the data that you need so you can make the determination about having a particular cause and then how to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So then we talk about estrogen deficiency, estrogen dysfunction, same thing again, symptoms, asterisks, how to do the laboratory testing, how to interpret the labs, and then the education and the conclusion. Same thing with progesterone, same thing with testosterone, nutrients, so I go through it for all these. I'm trying to get to the
So he's got
toxicities.
B12, he's got vitamin D, I'm sure you have maybe magnesium in here. There you
Yep.
go, on the very next
Magnesium
page.
is a favorite one. Yep.
And so he's specifically taking you through symptoms that are indicative of deficiencies in those vitamins or minerals, as well as the tests that you can do to verify whether you have a deficiency or potentially a toxicity. Something like iron might be a toxicity in iron that you might want to test for.
Right.
And for some of these, the lab tests really matter. So as an example, magnesium. You really want to measure intracellular magnesium inside of red blood cells, which is a very specific kind of test that you need to get done. So there are some kinds of tests that you might test for certain kinds of vitamins or minerals, for example, or hormones or neurotransmitters that just aren't good data. And so it really matters the specific type of test that you get. Right. Just having access to Dr. Hirsch's list of which tests are the good ones that you want to get and which tests are a waste of money is itself extremely valuable.
Absolutely. So then we get into the lifestyle stuff. So sleep deficiency, a lot of people are like, well, I think I sleep fine. And they don't realize that if they're not sleeping 7 to 9 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and they're not getting into deep sleep and they're napping during the day and, the blue light blocking and all this sort of other exposures that they might be exposed to, that it's actually an issue for them.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that a lot of the causes of fatigue are also causes of sleep dysfunction. And that's why they go hand in hand. And then, making sure that you're drinking the right amount of water, assessing whether or not they are, in fact, drinking enough. And so we do that. We can also look at certain labs to determine what their kidney function is, because if there's a certain ratio between your BUN or your blood urea nitrogen and your creatinine, will determine also if you're dehydrated. So that's kind of a nice laboratory confirmatory marker. And then what I call a good food deficiency. So if if people are not eating enough good food, if you're eating too much grains, so I have a little questionnaire for you here. If you're not consuming enough organic, if you're consuming too much gluten, dairy, corn, sugar, alcohol, stuff like that. And then there's actually labs that we can do to look at the amount of pesticides, the amount of glyphosate, which is the main ingredient in Roundup. And then I tell you exactly how to do that lab test, because oftentimes with this testing, you want to provoke it. So oftentimes with a lot of this toxicity, it's housed inside the organs and the tissues. And that if you just do a blood test or you just do a urine test, you're not going to find these chemicals. You have to push them out of their hiding places and then assess in the urine.
Yeah. I have a quick question for you
Yeah.
to interrupt your flow here.
Please do.
So just taking this particular page as an example, this good food deficiency. So some of the signs that you have listed here are: I do not consume whole fruits and vegetables. I consume lots of grains and processed food. Less than 80% of the food I consume is organic. I consume gluten, dairy, corn, sugar, or alcohol every 1 to 2 days. So we have those. Below those, you list these 2 lab tests that you could possibly do. So obviously, to go through this entire list of potential causes and do all the lab tests that you have listed here would be, I'm sure, many, many thousands of dollars, if not well over $10,000. So my question would be, do you have a system here of, first, you ask people to kind of go through and check the signs and symptoms, and only then, if they've checked a lot of boxes there, then you do the lab test for confirmation? Or are you saying just do the lab test for everything?
So it really depends on the individual. Obviously, if you do all of the lab tests, and the lab tests generally cost around $4,000 to get all of them done,
Okay.
which is still a lot of money. But if you the sooner that you do all of those, the sooner you're not going to miss anything. However, like I said, 75% of the causes can be determined by symptoms. And so generally I say, okay, if you've got a budget, do the 75%, and I have all of those. So that's 75% of 33 causes. So
Hmm.
that's still a lot of the causes that you can assess.
Yeah.
And then if you're fixing all of that stuff and you're not having success, then you can go ahead and you can assess some of those other ones. You can budget out the other ones, and that'll cost you, just for those, is probably less than $1,000.
Yeah. Got it. One thing I missed maybe as you were scrolling through, did you have one that was sleep deficiency?
I did.
Okay. I'm curious if you had any tests listed for that one. Are there any lab tests that you use to assess for sleep deficiency?
I don't believe. Oh, it was. So what I find is that I can actually get more people to sleep at night by giving them things in the morning that they're deficient in.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Light.
B12, thyroid, adrenals. I don't give them iron in the morning if they're taking thyroid, but all of those things can be incredibly helpful for resetting the circadian rhythm.
Yes. Not to mention sunlight, more sunlight in the morning.
Right. Absolutely. And all those things that you talk about in more
Mhm.
detail. And
Yeah.
then an abnormal sleep study can also be helpful.
Yeah.
You know,
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, that would be a relevant study to recommend for sleep. If you actually tell them to get a sleep study where they go to the lab and have, EEG monitors hooked up to their brain to check for the phases of sleep. I think actually there's some kind of at-home sleep test that there's a
Mhm.
company doing now as well. I don't know if the data is really as high of quality as a sort of more formal sleep study, but it's an interesting idea to make that kind of test more accessible to people.
Yeah, they're looking at oxygen desaturations overnight, and then they can hook somebody up with a CPAP or a BiPAP, and that's the only utility of that test, really.
Okay.
Because most of the time, when we do all this other stuff that you and I talk about for sleep, they're going to naturally their sleep is going to improve, and a lot of those markers improve, and so it's really only about the sleep apnea that you want them to get a CPAP for. But generally, as they do this work and as they improve all their overall health and they lose weight and whatever, then they stop snoring and they don't no longer need the CPAP.
Hmm.
So, but it
Got
can
it.
it can help initially.
Got it. What else we have going on in here?
Question. So yeah, so it's just about time to jump into the toxicities. Neurotransmitters I'm still out on. I've spoken to a number of different practitioners that have found that replacing neurotransmitters is incredibly helpful in resolving fatigue. It's kind of hit or miss for me, and so I'm still hesitant. I don't talk about it a lot, but I do have some information in here on it for
Yeah.
some people who may respond better to it, who do want to test their neurotransmitters.
Yeah. I'm also under the impression that the urine neurotransmitter tests are not super accurate or valid data and don't necessarily you do get data that tells you indications of serotonin levels and glutamate and dopamine and things like that, but there's a question. I think it's controversial as far as my understanding of how valid that data is.
Absolutely. And most of the time, you can determine what somebody's deficient in based off of their symptoms. If they're more
Okay.
depressed, then low serotonin usually. If they're more anxious, low GABA. If they're more angry, oftentimes that can be dopamine, or if they have some addictive tendencies. So oftentimes you can treat based off of that. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is hit or miss. And it's
Yeah.
still
It's
Band-Aids at that point too.
I want to just point out something for emphasis. There are cases, not quite a lot of cases, I think, where symptoms can actually be a better indication of a problem than a lab test. And this neurotransmitter example is a really good one. We know certain symptoms correlate really well with certain neurotransmitter imbalances, whether it's serotonin or dopamine and things like that. But as I said, the actual lab test, which one would think, is kind of intuitively you think, oh, that's more accurate, it's much less crude, it's much more sophisticated and more advanced, more scientific, more cutting edge. That should be giving me much better data than what I could do just by looking at a checklist of symptoms. But in fact, in a case like this, the checklist of symptoms is really probably arguably better data. I would argue better data.
Yeah, and I would agree with that for almost every single one of these causes.
Wow.
So, I mean, even in medical school, I learned that, 90% is history and symptoms, 5% is physical exam, and 5% is laboratory data. And so,
Hmm.
most docs forget that, but that's been tried and true for years and years and years.
Yeah, especially in the way functional medicine has gone. Really, I mean, the origins of functional medicine are wonderful, and
Right.
but there are a lot of practitioners that I see more and more today who are not on board with what you just said, and who are really they just run a battery of lab tests and just have, sort of their cookie cutter templates for whatever results come back negative, and they're not doing this more in depth that you're talking about, that's really more based on clinical expertise and is about correlating the symptoms and putting even more emphasis on the symptoms, and then just using the lab test to corroborate the findings and the suspicions based on the symptoms.
Right. Yeah, it is unfortunate. And then movement or exercise deficiency. And as most of you or a lot of you may know, that you may not be able to exercise. It's good to always get some movement, even if you can't. Movement is really the panacea of so many things, and it's so important for detoxification and lymph flow and so many other things, mood. And so move as you can, but don't be put off by the fact that you can't exercise to the nth degree, because oftentimes I see that, and that just makes people, if you feel worse after you exercise, you're exercising too much.
Hmm. Yeah. And this is a quick digression, but you also have listed here, if your fatigue is causing your lack of exercise, then don't start exercising until your energy improves up to a 6 out of 10.
Right.
So, in other words, if you're not at a 6 out of 10, maybe don't incorporate exercise into your regimen at all. Um, I know that there's some mixed opinions on that within among chronic fatigue syndrome experts.
Hmm.
There's sort of mixed opinions on whether these people should or should not be doing exercise. So what's your take on that principle?
So, I'm a fan. I learned about hormesis from you, and I'm a fan of exercise for hormesis. But I've also seen that if the activity or whatever it is stresses the body, and the body can't deal with the stress, and it just makes somebody worse, and they're
Mhm.
not able to progress, then it doesn't make sense to do it.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
The dose matters too, and in some severe cases I think there are people who just can't tolerate any and
Right.
even a little bit of hormesis. I've seen even with something like red and near infrared light therapy, which is much more gentle than exercise is. There's a really small subset of people, maybe 1% of people, who will react negatively to even a minute or two of red and near infrared light therapy. So, yeah, for sure, I agree with you.
And oftentimes I tell them, like you said, dose, it's all about decreasing the frequency. Like if you're exercising every day, go to maybe it's once a week or 3 times a week, and decrease the amount of time, the duration that you're actually doing it. So if you can get away with doing 15 minutes 3 times a week, and you don't crash that day or the next day, then that's a good dose for you. And then you want to increase by maybe a minute every couple of weeks, and so you can work your way up to, while you're also doing a number of these other things that are building you up.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's a good combo.
Yeah. And lab tests, again, obviously for physical movement, no lab data no lab tests that one can do, which is, again, just to point out to people, um, you could do a whole battery of $20,000 of all the fanciest lab tests in the world, but none of those results would give you a piece of data that would tell you this person is sedentary as
Right.
opposed to not exercising. So, which is we know that physical movement and exercise is one of the most powerful medicines that we could possibly do for our health. And no amount of lab testing could actually clue us in to whether that person this is a root cause of their issue or not. So, just again to point out, your approach, which really puts a lot of emphasis on symptoms, which of course I agree with 100%. Um, and then using the lab tests to confirm or rule out certain specific things where we have good lab tests to help with that.
Absolutely. It's a good point. So then let's jump into the toxicities, which are really where it's at, because all of the deficiencies that we just talked about really, for the most part, are caused by the toxicities. So I tell people that we replace the deficiencies as step 2 because it helps you feel better faster. You're actually able to engage more with your life. You're feeling better, and you're able to then go into step 3 and open up the detox pathways, and then go into step 4, which is removing all the crap that's in your body. So you have to go through this process, even though replacing those deficiencies is really a band-aid approach, even though it is more of a natural band-aid approach.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing is constipation, because if you're not pooping, you can't get stuff out of the body, right? So you have to be able to get stuff out of your stool, out of your intestines. You have to be able to pee out the toxicities that your body accumulates. You want to be able to sweat it out. You want to be able to exhale it out or breathe it out. Those are like our main routes of natural detoxification. And so if you're constipated, like I was most of my life growing up, I thought pooping once a week was normal. Oh my gosh. And so if you're not pooping every day, at least ideally twice a day, then all you're doing is reabsorbing all the toxins that you're trying to get out of your body. And so you have to make sure. So we talk about constipation, and I list off the symptoms. Here are the symptoms of constipation. You may have some of these symptoms. There's no lab tests to do. There's no laboratory data to interpret. And then in my experience, it's likely if you have constipation, if you have the above symptoms, and basically you're not having a bowel movement every day. 2 is ideal, 1's okay, as long as it's a good one.
I usually have 2 before we get to noon.
Nice.
Yeah. No,
That's awesome.
I think this is the first time I've spoken publicly about my bathroom habits. So this is a first on the podcast.
Awesome. Well, I was going to say your secret's safe with me, but now it's out.
It's definitely not only safe with you.
Well, I can say also that I now stool 2 to 3 times a day. And for somebody who, was once a day until I was like 22, like that's an amazing accomplishment.
Nice. I've never been more proud of you, my friend.
Thank you. It's amazing. So then here's an important one. So this one is really one that we're talking about molds, for those of you who can't see the page, is really important to look at. You can definitely look at the symptoms, but here's one where the laboratory data is really helpful. So fatigue, muscle weakness or cramps, joint pain and stiffness, sinus issues can be pretty specific, nosebleeds in particular, chronic sinus congestion. You can have a chronic cough. You can have itchy ears or itchy anus. Oftentimes those can be yeast or mold related. You can have a number of neurologic things, dizziness, disorientation, tremors, paralysis, numbness, tingling, mood swings, brain fog, and mold sensitivity, where basically you go into a moldy space and you can immediately smell mold, or that you react to mold. And the ability to smell mold on entering a space. So those symptoms can be pretty specific, but it's always really helpful, because mold is one of those things that you don't want to wait 6 to 12 months down the line and be like, okay, we're not getting the success that we want. I really wish that we would have looked at mold in your home and looked at mold in your body. And generally we can just look at mold in your body initially. And if you don't have any mold in your body, then you're not going to have any mold in your home.
Mm-hmm.
If you have mold in your body and then you look at it in your home, if it's in your home, then that mold could have come from the current home that you're in, or it could have come also from a previous home. If you've got it in your body, you don't have it in your current home, then it means that you got it in a previous home.
Well,
so
how long does it stay in your body?
Forever. So you could have been exposed at the age of 5. And if you weren't taking binders and glutathione and getting a lot of this stuff out, then it's just going to stay, because it's just a nice, warm, moist environment.
The actual mold, not the mycotoxins, but the mold itself is growing in the body.
Sorry, mycotoxins.
Okay.
But how
could the mycotoxins stick around for years?
They just do. I mean, it's if somebody is. And it's possible that they will be removed at some point, but the detoxification process is so slow, because there'll be somebody who, let's say we test their home and there's no mold in their home. And granted, once again, all tests are imperfect, but let's say it's a good test. and there's no mold in their current home. Let's say we know that there's no mold in their previous home, but they said, every year growing up, our basement flooded and it always smelled funky,
Mm-hmm.
and they've got mold in their body. So, I mean, I don't know. All I know is that, that seems to be the culprit. It doesn't
Wow.
seem to be anything that they've been exposed to recently.
Wow.
And so whether it's the mold that is just proliferating and then producing the mycotoxins, or whether it's the mycotoxins, I don't know. And I'm not sure that we actually really do know, but I do know
Interesting.
that when we make sure that people are not in a moldy environment and we remove the mold out of their bodies, that amazing things happen. And that you can't, I digress a little bit, but you can't get rid of infections if you have heavy metals, chemicals, and molds present.
Mm-hmm.
They just hijack the immune system. You have to have a somewhat intact immune system to work with any of the antimicrobials that you're going to use in order to get rid of infections. And there's been
Yeah.
several studies on this, specifically with mold and Lyme, where people had both. They remove the mold and the Lyme goes away as well because you've recruited that immune system to be helpful. So
Mm-hmm. Now, with that in mind, so we only have a little less than 10 minutes left. You just mentioned infections. I know that's a big part of what you do. We've talked about it on past podcasts. Can you just briefly go over some of the key infections that are sometimes big causes of people for people with chronic fatigue, and what tests are useful in those cases? And
absolutely.
we're skipping over heavy metals here, various other chemicals. I'll just list them off here as we're going through this stealth. So now we're on stealth infections.
Right, but we're going to go into the specifics of the stealth infection. So,
Okay.
yeah, so really important stuff. And even the Centers for Disease Control talk about how these infections really are clinical diagnoses. So there's a conglomeration of symptoms that you can look at that can determine whether or not you have this infection, and that the Western blot test is really a epidemiologic study. It's not for diagnosis, according to the CDC.
Mm-hmm.
So with Borrelia, you cannot have Borrelia unless you have symptoms that come and go. So basically, you have good days and bad days. So this is generally, you cannot schedule something because you don't know whether it's going to be a good day or a bad day.
And real quick, Borrelia, just for people who don't know, is one of the key microbes responsible for Lyme disease.
Correct. And it's actually what Lyme was when Lyme, Connecticut, 1984 or whatever, they found Borrelia burgdorferi, named for the pathologist Bergdorf. And so that's why it's called Lyme. But it's really, when people are talking about Lyme, they're always talking about Borrelia. Sometimes they will talk about Lyme and its co-infections as Lyme. And we'll talk about some of those other co-infections now. So you just have to be careful about what they're actually referring to. But in this case, we're talking about Borrelia burgdorferi. So the symptoms will come and go. So you have good days and bad days. And then you'll have symptoms that will move around the body. So if you have joint pain, muscle pain, or nerve pain, like electric shocks or whatever, they will move around the body. So let's say, and sometimes it's within a day. So let's say you wake up, you've got shoulder pain, and then a couple hours later, you've got knee pain. It's moved to your knee. A couple hours later, it moves back to the shoulder or whatever. Or it may take several days or several weeks to switch. It'll be shoulder pain for a couple of weeks, and then it switches to knee pain for a couple of weeks or whatever. So if you don't have those symptoms, then you can't have Borrelia. There's really not much that actually causes those sorts of symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be really helpful. I do like the if you are going to do a lab test, the urine PCR test, the DNAconnections.com test, their Lyme panel, as long as it's provoked with lymph massage or 30 minutes of exercise prior, can be helpful, but the symptoms really are where it's at.
Got it.
And that looks at several different species and subspecies as well, different families, which can be really helpful. So, and then anaplasma or ehrlichia, they're both the same thing with a different name. You'll have a high fever, headache, fatigue, and musculoskeletal pain. But then you'll also have some of these others that some of the others don't have. You'll have low white cell count, less than 4. You'll have a low platelet count, less than 150, and you'll have elevated liver function tests.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of helps tease that one out. So that's one where the laboratory data can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And then Babesia is a Lyme co-infection. This is Babesia microti that we're looking at. And so Sweating is a really big one, where people will have day sweats or night sweats. Oftentimes they'll run hot. They'll generally say, I'm the hottest person in the room. It'll be like 20 degrees outside, and they'll be like outside shoveling snow in a t-shirt. Or they notice that they're constantly feel like they have to take off their clothes because it's so hot, and everybody else is much cooler than they are. The night sweats, they'll soak the sheets. They'll have lung issues that they can't explain, like sometimes it's shortness of breath or air hunger, where they feel like they can't get enough breath. And then the sleep is usually awful, hard time falling asleep, hard time staying asleep. And then the mood stuff is really bad. So this is anxiety to the point of panic. Oftentimes they're crying at me on the phone. Depression to the point of suicidal thoughts. And these are generally the people who do commit suicide usually have babesia. Because it makes you feel so incredibly hopeless. Unfortunately, treatment.
Needless to say, if this is one of the causes of fatigue and these other symptoms for you, something like this is extremely important to address urgently, because it literally could be life altering in the truest sense of that word to address this or not address it.
And I feel very fortunate because the formulas that I use, especially for babesia, work incredibly well. I mean, they turn things around. There are some that aren't like 90%, and the one for babesia works really well.
Awesome.
Which is really nice. And then Bartonella is a big one too that I've spoken on before. So cold hands and feet, that's not related to thyroid. If the thyroid's been optimized and there's still cold hands and feet, oftentimes they'll get occasional fevers, usually at night. They'll get pains in the bottom of the feet. So this can be, like if you're walking around your house barefooted and you're like, gosh, I wish I had slippers on, to the point of burning on the bottom of the feet or pain in the feet, sometimes in the bones of the feet, sometimes in the bones of the hands. Sharpshooting, knife-like headaches, sometimes joint pain in a single joint. The muscle cramps are pretty typical, whether it's a cramp in the calves, usually at night, or can be cramps in other parts. And oftentimes those cramps can be relieved by taking, potassium or drinking enough water. And you're like, oh, it was just dehydration. Well, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
And then you also can get some sleep issues. You can get some anxiety and depression, but they're not as bad as babesia. And then Epstein-Barr virus is a big one, and some of the other viruses, cytomegalovirus, which can also cause mono. So if somebody had mono, it could have been from Epstein-Barr, or it could have been from cytomegalovirus. So people don't realize there's a cytomegalovirus type mono that can occur.
Yeah.
And then HHV6 is another virus. And they're pretty non-specific. So fever, swollen lymph nodes, fatigue, memory loss, and brain fog. And there are some labs that you can get on this too. Unfortunately, the best labs for this are serology tests, so it's looking at the immune system's reaction to these bugs, which is highly imperfect, but can be helpful certain times.
Dr.
So in
Hirsch,
the interest of time,
this is just awesome stuff. I know we could go on forever, but we're pretty much nearing the end of our allotted time together, and obviously this is just amazing what you've put together here to compile in a really systematic way all of the most common symptoms for chronic fatigue, especially for people dealing with severe fatigue. I think this is just an invaluable resource for people to go in. And let me just even add one more thing there. For people that have severe fatigue, for people that feel like they've tried everything and nothing's worked for them, to be able to really systematically in a surgical, precise way go in and have the list of symptoms and the specific lab tests to get to corroborate if that's a particular cause for you, with all the major potential causes of fatigue just listed out there. So someone can go through this workbook, fill out the workbook, fill out the symptom questionnaires, do the lab tests where necessary, and then come back with a really, a map, really just a guide, personalized guide for what are the specific things that I need to address to finally fix my chronic fatigue and stop fumbling around with the sort of just mishmash of a mess of information online between all these contradictory claims of different diets and should I exercise, should I not exercise, and all just a mess of information and experimenting with this or that one thing. But to really just have this map of exactly what are the causes for that particular individual that they need to address, I think is invaluable. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing here. I'm super excited for your program that you have coming out. I'm super excited to promote it to my audience. Obviously, we're doing that here in this show. We're taking people through exactly what your method looks like. And so obviously in your program, you're guiding people through this in the full form, not the 45-minute form. But I know you're about to release this program in a few weeks, and I'm obviously going to help promote that for you because I want to help as many people dealing with chronic fatigue who have not had help as possible. And we're going to set, I think you have a series of videos that you're releasing for free that kind of takes people through this. Right. Do you have an option if people already know that they want this and this is for them? Maybe we can set that up at, if you're open to it, we can set it up at theenergyblueprint.com. Evan Hirsch, and it's Hirsch. So if you go to theenergyblueprint.com, Evan Hirsch, we'll set up a link to the masterclass where he has, if you want to go more in depth, his free training on this. And then we'll also set up a link if you know that you want this. We'll set up a direct link to actually purchase the program. Evan, Dr. Hirsch, when is this program actually coming out? Is it the end of February, sometime in March?
It is just in the next week here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So it's So we're at February 4th, and it's the 7th.
Okay. I won't be able to get it out that soon because this podcast needs to be. We got to edit it. We have a whole process that we got to work the podcast through. But
it'll still be available.
Okay, it will be available in March, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think March is what works for me to
Perfect.
Get this podcast out and promote your program. So yeah, I'm super excited for this. Thank you for the work you do, Dr. Hirsch. I really appreciate everything you're doing, and I'm a fan of what you're doing. And thank you for sharing your expertise on this podcast with me. This was excellent, and it was actually great to not just do sort of a typical talking head style interview, but to have you do the actual screen share of your document and kind of go step by step. Here is my list of causes of fatigue. Here are the specific symptoms for this and that cause. And here are the exact, tests that I use to corroborate whether this is an issue for people. I think to go into that granular of detail and really give people the experience of what is actually in your program, I think is wonderful. So thank you for coming on the show again for number 3, and really enjoyed it, and look forward to talking to you again very soon.
Thanks for having me on, Ari. It's always a blast.
Yeah, my pleasure. And again, for everybody listening, go to theenergyblueprint.com/Evan Hirsch, all one word, Evan Hirsch. And we will set up a link to get access to his free training, as well as a link to purchase the program. Thank you again, Dr. Hirsch. I will talk to you very soon. Thank you to everybody listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hey, everyone. This is Ari again. And after we finish recording that podcast episode that you just listened to with Dr. Evan Hirsch, there has been the whole COVID-19 outbreak, and people are in a big state of panic over the situation. Rightfully so, according to most of the experts. And a lot of people are very worried. More importantly than the state of panic, there are a lot of people that have really suffered financially from this. As of the time I'm recording this, over 3 million people have been laid off from their jobs already. And a lot of people are going bankrupt. I have friends who are restaurant owners, dentists, things of that nature, whose businesses are just entirely shut down, and they're at risk for going bankrupt now. They have tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of monthly overhead, and they have zero money coming in right now, and they're having to lay off employees, and they're really suffering. So having said that, a lot of people are in this situation financially. I reached out to Evan and asked him if he could do anything about the price of his program. which is normally $2,000, which is a pretty high-priced program, but worth it because of the guidance that he's giving you in this program. And I'm happy to say that he agreed to give $1,000 discount off of the normal cost. So you can enter the discount code TEB, which stands for the Energy Blueprint, TEB 1000, TEB 1000 as the discount code when you're checking out and ordering this program. That will knock off $1,000 off of the normal $2,000 price. So I'm really happy that he did that for all of our audience here with the Energy Blueprint. And I hope that you guys are doing well and staying safe and staying healthy during this time of all of the fear around the coronavirus. I also want to let you know I've been trying to provide resources. I have more podcasts lined up on this subject, more free resources and helpful information that I'm going to be providing on how you can protect yourself and your family from coronavirus specifically. And I'm really doing everything I can to put together safe and effective recommendations for you guys to follow there. There's a lot of stuff that's not very good coming out, a lot of pseudoscience, a lot of stuff that might be counterproductive. For example, the use of antimicrobials preemptively is not a good recommendation, in my opinion. So I want to let you know I'm going to continue to provide resources on that front, but specifically for fatigue, if you've been dealing with chronic fatigue, if you haven't found good answers, if you feel like you're taking care of your nutrition and your lifestyle habits and you're just not seeing the kind of results that you were hoping to see, well, you might have some kind of hidden factor, whether it's mold mycotoxins, whether it's hormonal issues, whether it's some kind of chronic infection. You might have something like that going on that is your key cause. And this program from Dr. Hirsch can really help you uncover those hidden causes and fix your chronic fatigue. So I encourage you all who are in that situation to get this course. And I've done everything in my power to get you access to this course as cheaply as possible, working with Evan to knock $1,000 off the normal price, get it for you 50% off. So again, if you've been dealing with chronic fatigue, if you're in that situation I just described, go get this course. It is absolutely worth it. It is a very, very wise investment in your health and in your quality of life to figure out this fatigue issue, to uncover these hidden causes that might be going on for you and get this area of your life handled so that you can live the rest of your life with energy, with happiness, doing the things that you want to do in life and not be stuck on the couch watching your life go by because of feeling chronically fatigued. So go get the course. You can get it at theenergyblueprint.com /Evan Hirsch. It's EVANHIRSCH. And then to get that discount code, just enter the discount code TEB 1000. The number is 1000. So TEB 1000. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next week. Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.